let me just shed light on few elements of what different special envoys have been doing for the past many years, but at least this office. And I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, I have served with 3 special envoys, Lakhdar Ibrahimi, and then Stefan de Mistura, and now with Gabe Pedersen. And with the 3 in different, I was working on different levels. Sometimes I was in the field, in Damascus, and other times I'm just, based as a spokesperson and all now as a deputy. In all of these efforts, people ask, why are you keeping doing it? And I don't want to get into personal, but this leads me to the discussion on how difficult building peace is. While war can be so easy, at one moment it was a war between, 2 or 3, if you like, parties. All of a sudden, you get more and more military groups, involved in it. And then you get interest, and Syria is one of those that have, and unfortunate as it is, those who have interest or influence need to be convinced that peace is much useful for them than war. So in this, I think, and going back to the theme of this discussion and panel, the idea of engaging as many Syrians as possible is very important. And I cannot emphasize enough that this has been done by the different special envoys and the current special envoy and the UN in general, is to engage not only, if you like, the government and the opposition, but to get the whole society involved and the whole society reached and feel that they are listened to. So in that we get more than one track. We get the involvement by the office with the civil society. We get the Women Advisory Board with its civil society room, Women's Advisory Board, and then you get a chance to listen to voices. But the most important, and in Syria, it's the unique chance around the Constitutional Committee. You get parties that are nominated by the government, the other party by the opposition, and you have the civil society, which is the middle third, involved. So voices are needed in a political process. And voices need to go as grassroots as possible. And let's not be, fooling ourselves and say, as UN, or as those who are involved in building peace, we will be able to reach each and every Syrian. We are, through other Syrians, engaging and trying to reach the largest number. And this is, it works both ways. It works as a tool to get what the Office of the Special Envoy and the UN as a whole is doing to build peace, to put pieces on the ground for this very difficult road, and how this office is also, or this middle, civil society and women, can bring the voices of the Syrians from local community, inside Syria, in the refugee camps, in areas that are not under the control of the government, and bringing the different minorities, if you like, or ethnic, or those who feel marginalized or have been feeling marginalized. They should feel that they have a main role in building peace. Nobody should left behind. No one should not be included in a political process. And as much as we all are working together, this is what makes it a stronger, I think, is bringing all those parties, especially international, but also regional and local, to work together towards peace and not to compete against each other. And that's an element that we in the UN, and I think all of our partners are, and friends, are doing. We're trying to engage as many as possible. Let me just say a few words about challenges. Challenges is, with Syria, is that it seems that there isn't yet a will to end the crisis. And this is not by Syrians, but apparently by the international community. There is a talk about ending the crisis in Syria, but we need to see it in action. And I think to see it in action, we need more than one path. 2254 is a major major, I think, breakthrough, and I think most Syrians will tell you, we would like to see the UN and all international players to implement 2254. And in that, we engaged the Constitutional Committee as a window to open the path for a political process. It's also a way to build trust in the political process, but we have to admit that we have, until now, not managed to get that process going and structured in a way to make Syrians feel that though they feel that a constitution will not solve their crisis, but a committee that works on a constitution and draft a constitution that reflects the aspirations of all Syrians, no matter if they are men, women, youth, they are Christians, Muslims, old, young, all of these should have a constitution that they feel it reflects not only their aspirations, but also the suffering they felt for the past 11 years. So 11 years will not be forgotten, and their suffering will not be forgotten. On the other level, the Special Envoy has started now what he calls the Geneva consultations, which is part of his approach of step for step. Many have been asking, and I have to say, Syrians have united against it on both sides, and that makes us more and more in need, maybe, to explain it to Syrians. What does the Special Envoy want to achieve? Step for step is, what are you? He sits with each and every neighboring country, a country that has influence, a country on any of the parties or interests, and say, what can you offer for the other side to offer something in return? Can you work on the issue of detainees, abductees, and missing persons? Each and every Syrian family has a member who is either missing or detained, or they don't know anything and had no information since 2012. Women that we meet say that members of their families have disappeared or are detained, and they know nothing about them. We're also working with the Astana working group on this issue and trying to knock all doors to try and build some confidence and the feeling among Syrians that they will know what happened to their loved ones, or they will bury the bodies of those who died and close that chapter of grievances. So that is also a file that is highly, highly needed to build confidence in the whole political process, but also for Syrians to believe in the international community that they are serious about it. They are serious about reducing their suffering. And I think the suffering right now in Syria is even exacerbated by the economic situation. And I spend most of my time in Damascus, but I also engage with Syrians in the neighboring countries and in the diaspora. And the feeling is we are all united in the suffering. We all are suffering in the same level. We are all paying a high price for this crisis, while those who have the power to continue this crisis are not suffering. It's the people who are suffering. And I have to say a few words, if you allow me, before I stop, and I don't want to just take all the discussion to that direction. I would like to listen to the questions and also to comments, is that you walk the streets in Syria and it's all women because the men have died or have left the country or disappeared. And they are all young. And now you have 2 million Syrians who are out of school. Syria used to be the highest in terms of achievement in education and in health. That was in 2010. Among the neighboring countries, I'm not comparing it to the developed nations, but I'm comparing it to the region according to the UN statistics. Now Syria lacks, and it's now at the end of the sustainable development goals. The education has dropped. Syrians in the refugee camps are actually more and more young children are left with no option. The families cannot send them to school. They are suffering to keep them alive. And we are seeing more and more children pushed to the labor market. And more women have to work when they have no capacity, and most of the time they are abused by the economic circle in a labor market, in a given labor market. I would like to stop here, but just try to say a few words about maybe now is the time, because now there is a discussion about Syria, but Syrians feel more and more that Syria is not on top of the agenda of those who can make a difference. Syria should, for us, the only thing that we give hope to the Syrians by saying we keep it alive and we keep trying to push for it to be on top of the agendas of those who meet, the political leaders of the world, the Russians and the Americans. Every time there is a meeting, or the EU, the Syrians ask us, was Syria on the agenda? And that's a main question for us now, is to keep Syria and to keep the suffering of the Syrians as part of our goal to achieve and reduce it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khawla, for sharing also about the immense challenges of Syria that also your office faces, but also how you engage at different levels, listening to Syrian voices, trying to empower them, working towards the political process, but also very much engaging the international actors who, after all, have to play their part in resolving it. Thank you very much. With that, we turn to Ambassador Simon Geissbühler. Switzerland, of course, works at different levels as well. It has mediated and mediates in armed conflicts, provides good offices, but also has programs of peace promotion that it works at different levels of society. And in your experience, how have these different levels played together?
Thank you so much for this introduction, Philipp. It's great to be here, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. The Basel Peace Forum has really become an annual fixture, a place to meet and discuss innovative ideas, get to know people, talk about peace building and beyond. I'll highly appreciate this forum and would like to thank, of course, the Canton of Basel-Stadt and Swiss Peace for hosting us. This topic is very important to Swiss foreign policy. We are committed to this multi-track approach as a part of our peace and mediation work. I will give you some examples later on in my short presentation how we concretely apply this multi-track approach in different peace processes. But before I do so, let me briefly say a few words about what we mean when we talk about multi-track approaches and why these approaches are important. There are many technical definitions, and you have mentioned the report you have co-published, a great report, you should have a look at it. It's short, but really very well done. It gives a useful overview of some of the definitions that are out there. In essence, multi-track means that a dialogue or negotiations are led at multiple levels and in both formal and informal settings. These efforts involve official actors, for example, government representatives, but crucially also civil society. In turn, this diversity of formats and stakeholders helps to achieve more legitimate and sustainable results, and I will get back to that. Let me mention 3 reasons why multi-track approaches in peace processes are important. First, we see that conflicts today are increasingly complex. And this means that it is simply not possible to resolve all issues once and for all at one single negotiation table. And multi-track approaches respond to these challenges. They also make it possible to divide issues, to sequence a process across multiple negotiation formats, and to involve the actors that are best placed to resolve them. Second, you know this better than I do, many conflicts play out at the local and subnational level. And these issues cannot be resolved on the national level. And multi-track approaches recognize the principle of subsidiarity, which we know very well here in Switzerland. I will briefly come back to that. And the importance of dialogue at this subnational, at this local level. They help to unlock support for these important efforts. And multi-track approaches can also help to create bridges among otherwise divided societies. And third, looking at peace processes in the past, it is clear that peace requires to talk to armed groups, to those who fight. At the same time, it is also clear that agreements are not an end point. An exclusive focus on negotiations between armed conflict parties does most often not lead to sustainable solutions. And we have seen that again and again, that peace agreements collapse very quickly because they're not sustainable, they're not designed in a way that they can last. What matters most, of course, is always the implementation. Paper is very patient. That's why the peace agreements themselves are not enough. Equally important are efforts to build peace, promote reconciliation, and facilitate dialogue after a major peace agreement. Let me highlight another element, and I briefly mentioned it already, the link between multi-track approaches and, in a certain way, the Swiss political culture. I think multi-track approaches are deeply rooted in our political culture, in our political system, and they are also positively connotated when it comes to a Swiss discourse about these multi-track approaches. There are principles that apply to multi-track approaches in peace policy and the Swiss political system and the Swiss polity alike. For instance, the principle of inclusion, very important in the Swiss political system, in lawmaking also in Switzerland. I don't need to go into detail here about that. And also the principle of subsidiarity, which is a key principle in the Swiss polity. And it means that political issues are dealt with where the people are immediately affected by them and where they have a direct interest in a resolution of these issues. As I said at the beginning, Switzerland is committed to multi-track approaches as a part of its peace policy. This does not, however, mean that we necessarily aim to work on all tracks everywhere and all the time. I represent the government, so it's clear that for us the main focus is on track 1, on the official track. But we acknowledge that there are other tracks, they're important, they're as important as track 1, as I said before. And we, as a Swiss government, we are also part of a wider peace-building ecosystem. We are not alone out there. And we try to include and collaborate with efforts at different levels. And I will give you, in a second, a few examples for that. So much for the theory. But this is, in fact, not at all a theoretical discussion, and we have heard it before. This is a very practical, very concrete, and very important issue for peace practitioners who work in processes and in mediation efforts. 3 examples from my side, quickly. The first is Colombia. There we closely supported the ceasefire negotiations between the government of Colombia and the FARC. At the same time, Switzerland worked, and we continue to work, with social organizations, the church, to promote dialogue in the communities most affected by the violence. And we continue to do that in Colombia. This work helped to establish channels of communication between these communities and the ceasefire monitoring mechanism, allowing incidents to be swiftly addressed and keeping the implementation of the ceasefire on track. We also worked at the track 2 level, for example, by facilitating dialogue between the armed forces and key actors in Colombian society, such as leaders of social movements and representatives of indigenous people. Then Syria, we already heard about Syria. As you know, Switzerland hosts the UN-facilitated political process in Geneva. In addition to hosting, we support the inclusion of Syrian civil society into the political process through an innovative mechanism, the so-called civil society support room. Having an institutionalized civil society track is something quite special in the field of UN peace processes. It is implemented by the Office of the UN Special Envoy. Here I acknowledge, of course, the leadership of my co-panelist, Madam Deputy Special Envoy. And we support this together with NOREF and Swiss Peace. Beyond the political process, we also support Syrian civil society at the grassroots level. And our ambition is to bring these voices, and you have said it, these voices, important voices, to the official peace process and to create bridges between the fragmented Syrian society. Then the last example is Cameroon, where we are very much engaged, and I'm happy to have several actors who work with us together in this field, in this context here in the room. We have a facilitation mandate to help resolve the armed conflict in the English-speaking regions. We therefore try to work very closely with the government and with leaders of the pro-independence armed groups. Recognizing the need for a multi-track, comprehensive approach to peace, we also support the peace-building efforts of women's groups, religious leaders, and youth in Cameroon. We strongly believe they have an essential a role to play when it comes to the peace process. And here again, we work also with Swiss Peace, we work with others. So when I talk about we, it's not just the Swiss government, it's a much larger coalition, because we have to work in tandem, or even more than in tandem, to be successful, hopefully, in the future. We strongly believe that all these actors have an essential role to play in the peace process and in building bridges within Cameroonian society. And working at different levels of society informs our facilitation effort, as it provides us with a better understanding of the complex issues and dynamics at play within the conflict context. And we cannot understand these dynamics sitting in an office somewhere in Bern. In concluding, let me stress the importance, and it's a very concrete, as I said, very concrete and practical importance of multi-track approaches in peace processes. And I look forward to hearing from the third panelist, and then, of course, I look forward to the discussion. Thank you. Back to you, Philipp.
Thank you very much, Simon, for sharing from the perspective of Switzerland your own experience. And there's many points I retain, among others, also you emphasized that in a peace process, in a conflict, there are multiple issues. I think we also heard that from Khawla with regard to Syria. And they can be addressed in different spaces and not necessarily always only on one table, and at different levels. And that in Switzerland, of course, with the principle of subsidiarity, local, cantonal, national. And another point that you made, also the timeline of a peace process. And I think often in public perception, we see the important moments of a peace process, the signing of an agreement, and that's when the conflict is over, when it's solved. But actually, a peace process continues, because resolving many of the issues at the roots of a conflict, that takes time, and that certainly, with the signature of a peace agreement, is often an important moment, but a lot of the work goes beyond that. Thank you very much. With that, we turn to Ester, who's joining us, I think, from Boya. Ester, of course, working within civil society, living in the conflict-affected region, and very much engaged with communities, with grassroots women's peace builder, but also has been in many dialogue initiatives at different levels, and has a huge experience herself working with a multi-track approach. We're very interested in listening to you, Ester. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Philipp. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my singular pleasure to bring to you the voices of community women from the conflict-torn communities of the Northwest and Southwest regions of Cameroon. My special thanks go to Professor Laurent and the Swiss Peace team for this invitation to talk about the multi-track approaches and how emotions play into different levels of peace building. Many thanks also go to the UN women mediators across the Commonwealth, the International Civil Society Action Network, the Friedrich Herbert Stifel Foundation, the United States Institute for Peace, the Canadian High Commission, and a host of international partners for the many opportunities provided that have enabled us, and me also in particular, to gain knowledge and skills in peace building and mediation. As you all know, Cameroon as a nation is facing multiple crises, from the Boko Haram insurgency in the northern regions to the Selekas in the east, the Anglophone crisis in the northwest and southwest regions, the electoral crisis, the northwest versus the southwest emerging divide, the pastoral conflicts between the Fulanese and the indigenes, and now the COVID-19 crisis, just to name these few. Though our diverse interactions and navigations at different levels of the pyramid of society, be it grassroots, civil society, or political spaces, we have come to understand that multi-track approaches with the inclusion of women peace builders as key actors who connect to the different levels of society to find common ground is sustainable to peace. This is so because women peace builders often see the early warning signs of conflict and are well positioned as trusted local actors to respond to multiple conflicts in a holistic way, using their heads and their hearts to serve as bridges, connecting the different levels for positive outcomes. Then I'm tempted to ask this question: how can peace initiatives then, at different levels of society, from the political to the grassroots level, complement each other? Without the actions of civil society, peace initiatives risk a total disconnect between grassroots and political spaces. When women peace builders are included in peace initiatives, they bring the perspective and care for all the different groups in their communities, including marginalized ethnic or religious groups, persons with disability, youth, and others with intersecting vulnerabilities. We are better placed to amplify the voices of grassroots communities through meetings with key government officials, as we have done and we have been doing and will continue doing, with the leaders of the non-state armed groups. We've been talking to them remotely, and we had to travel to the USA to meet the leaders of the non-state armed groups in order to talk to them to lift the ban imposed on on schools. For 5 years going, our children have been refused access to schools, and so we had to take the courage to go and meet these leaders. Also, religious leaders, diplomatic missions, or international organizations, all these we've been talking with. There is room for complementarity when civil society actors serve as interface, relaying the concerns of grassroots peace builders to political actors and vice versa. For this to happen, we women have learned that we must be engaged from the outset of any peace process and ensure that we have regular opportunities to brief delegations and provide gendered analysis from the grassroots to political actors. This underlines the need for an independent delegation of women peace builders to ensure that peace actors have a presence at the table and to work towards the systematic inclusion of women in peace processes. It's been difficult and still difficult, but we're fighting hard to say that our voices are heard and included where needed in this country. Women will continue to advocate for a change in political will and adoption of the National Development Strategy and the National Action Plan for the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. If that be the case, what then are the opportunities? What are the challenges and risks of linking peace initiatives at different levels of society? How can we mediators and other peace support peace actors, promote and leverage such linkages between different peace initiatives and the purpose of working towards sustainable peace. From my humble experience, I have come to understand diverse perspectives on issues of identity, marginalization, education, and the us versus them dichotomy in conflict. I have come to understand that peace processes are not two parties, rational linear processes. They involve emotions that drive the motivation and interests of different groups. Amidst this, there are opportunities, challenges, and risks linked to peace initiatives that must be carefully analyzed at different levels of our society. Which are some of those opportunities? We, the women peace builders in Cameroon, have had the presence, and we still have the presence, of international and humanitarian community, including peace actors within the country and abroad. A good example is the Swiss Peace, which took us from the very early beginning up to this stage where we are, where I can talk to you with all confidence in matters related to peace building and mediation. You have the UN, you have the Friedrich Ebert Sinful Foundation, you have the German Embassy, the UK, you have the USA, you have a good number of them belonging in the global movement of women peace builders and mediators, such as the International Civil Society Action Network, which spearheads the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership, or the women mediators across the Commonwealth, which have given visibility and support to the work of women peace builders, advocating for the recognition of their work and sacrifices has been a tremendous opportunity, which we cannot overemphasize. The increasing number of women peace builders and the creation of diverse networks, bringing women from varying backgrounds know-how, thus providing a myriad of levels of technicities to the peace building movement in Cameroon. We've had a good number of women peace builders networks in the day. In the words of women peace builders, we say diversity is strength. The ever first National Women's Peace Convention, which held in July 2021, has also constituted an opportunity for women to merge their divergent views for a better understanding of the mediation process at different levels. This is how we, women peace builders, consult with and include women across Cameroon and build coalitions among different groups of women to interact with different key stakeholders along the pyramid. We've been doing this with so many challenges. Having the government to collaborate in doing the minimum to bring people to the dialogue table is an uphill task because of the lack of political will. The different nature of the crisis rocking our country, Cameroon, has been a challenge in finding a singular approach in solving the crisis. Hence, the need for multidimensional approaches, which to date have achieved little success, given the challenge in finding common grounds. Threats and instrumentalization of women peace builders have made many not to fully engage in track 1 or 2 peace processes for fear of what may happen. Limited or inadequate funding, which could enable women peace builders to travel for crucial meetings or ensure their participation in peace processes is a challenge. Making parties in conflict understand that women are key players in any conflict prevention and resolution initiatives and should be considered in all peace processes has been a difficult task for us. Power tussles and fragmentation of us women peace builders networks have diluted our efforts and opportunities for synergy. Inadequate knowledge on ceasefire negotiations and agreements has greatly limited us, the women, in achieving sustainable peace in our country. The provision of psychosocial support and trauma healing to victims of the crisis and women suffering burnouts as a result of this crisis is lacking because of the limitation in the availability of these services. And we go along working with so many risks. The government crackdown on civil society may lead to a shrinking civil society space. Lack of local ownership due to a divergence between donor demands and contextual realities. This has absorbed the real needs and caused tilted projects to suit donor requirements. Need assessments have often revealed a divergence from funding targets. In the context of recovery, it becomes even more crucial. The safety and security challenges faced by women peace builders is causing so many to relocate, like myself, who had to relocate sometime, to find shelter and continue to operate far from their original communities of oppression. This has also marred the quality of services provided and their absence in some of the key spaces or tracks. Now, with these multi-actors supporting peace initiatives at different levels of society, how can positive synergies and complementarity be promoted while preventing negative competition? What has worked well and what has not worked? As I often say, we must create more in order to have less. The promotion of synergies and complementarity can only be achieved if there is the will for concerted efforts. Peace-building actors must agree to a common identified purpose, set ground rules, and be ready to be tolerant while reinforcing capacities of their weaker counterparts through capacity building workshops. A case in point is the ever first National Women Peace Convention, where 38 organizations, female organizations, headed organizations, decided to come together and build a common front in order to interface between grassroots and the political actors in my country. So ensuring that all processes, all transactions with an agreed structure, respect, accountability, and transparency is key to success and avoids competition. The signing of the Peace Pact by the women of the National Women's Peace Convention and the openness of deliberations were good practices that enable us to stay and stick together, no matter our differences and divergent views. This is important because such differences will always exist. Exchange visits with women from other countries where multi-networks of peace building were successful are needed for experience sharing. This could be through online platforms or on-site to allow women or Cameroonian women to connect and learn from their counterparts in Liberia, Sudan, and other East African countries. Even so, the Colombian experience is the perfect one for sharing, especially if it connects to grassroots women for the better appropriation of peace initiatives and engagement at all the levels required. In order for women peace builders to engage and continue their work, they must be well protected, funded, recognized, and provided opportunities for self-care and capacity building through psychosocial support and peer-to-peer exchanges. With this, I will end by asking these questions.
Thank you so much, Esther.
How best can we effectively, with interventions at multitrack level, given the limited presence of women in some of these spaces, how best can we work effectively with interventions at multi-track level, given the limited presence of women in these spaces? How do we ensure the systematic inclusion of women at all levels without having to beg for belonging? Oftentimes, different tracks have different and sometimes opposing purposes, which can further propel the existing conflict and have negative effects on peace-building measures. We must therefore, at all times, ask ourselves, how best can multi-track approaches be complemented to achieve sustainable peace? Finally, as emotional beings with emotions that can't be caged, just to show how tough we are, we as women peace builders must ask ourselves, how best can our emotions be channeled to make the men understand that we mean business all the way and we want to build peace, piece by piece, throughout all the tracks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther, for sharing your experience. And one, I think, particularly important element that you highlighted is this key role of civil society. And let me say, particular women peace builders like yourself in connecting, that connecting function that civil society has effort, connecting different actors, but also different efforts from the grassroots up to the political and even international level. And I think that's something key that you highlighted and also gave examples how women have done that by networking and being able to listen, being very connected to the grassroots, but also having the ability to participate, for example, in a women's convention that took place last year in Cameroon. Thank you very much for that. I would now also like to invite the audience here in the room, but also those participating globally in this discussion to share their views and also to ask questions for our panelists here. I already see one question here in the room. I'll ask also those participating virtually to share their questions in the chat, and I'll have the opportunity to ask them also to our panelists here. And maybe if I can invite you to briefly introduce yourself.
Yes, Claude Bigley. They are in conflicts like the Syrian one, actors of different levels. Security Council countries, normal countries, armed non-state actors, civilian community. The multi-track approach implies to talk to all, and I suppose in theory, on an equal basis. My question is, to which extent do you really treat them on an equal basis, or do you have to operate on a de facto hierarchical basis? And the subsidiary question, this multi-track approach has, of course, a lot of similarities with the Swiss political culture. That's absolutely true. Now, our system implies time to build up a consensus. The context in wars can be very versatile, a bit volcanic, with fast changes of situation. How do you handle the factor time? Thank you.
Thank you for sharing the questions. I'll go to our panelists, and maybe I'll start with you, Khawla. And particularly, I think that first part of the question, you emphasized how it's important to talk to everyone.
Yeah.
Can you treat them equally? Do you have to separate whether you talk to a permanent member of the Security Council or to a Syrian woman who has been displaced or lives in country? How do you manage that?
I think it's, we can say politically and politely that we need to treat them equally. But I think in reality, we need to focus on few. As much as, with all due respect to all countries and Security Council can make or break sometimes, but I think we need to see, and the Syrians will tell you, because they know it better, talk to those who can have an impact on this partner or that group or that group. For example, would you talk to the Security Council members, and I'm being very realistic, and think that they can have all of them the same influence on the government of Syria, in the case of Syria, or the oppositions, because it's not one, the armed groups who are still functioning in many parts of Syria, or how do you do it? So it's multi-layers, and I think at times Syrians feel frustrated with us, UN and international community, that you're treating this more than that. And the Syrians will tell you in all parts, well, the decision is with us, so why are you going to capitals? But I think deeply they understand that the decisions need to be also in capitals. Like any peace process, and many in this room and I think in the audience have been through peace processes. But Syria, I think Cameroon is, and other examples are very complex, but I'm not the expert. I think Syria, when you look at it, it's just, layers, and at sometimes you need to see where to focus. It depends on what you want to achieve at a particular time. But I think you need to work among all, but not neglecting any, because sometimes you get drifted by, for example, now we have the Constitutional Committee, And sometimes when you have problems or difficulties or hurdles, we run to those who have influence, and everybody knows who they are. And sometimes we forget that we need others to influence those who have influence. So you need others to work with you, and you need to engage others. For example, the Swiss have been very helpful to this process. So you need to fill them with information, tell them what is needed, tell your friends and your partners and those who are with you in the same position, because not all are in the same position. And this leads me to a number of issues that have been raised, but I think I'll leave it to later. And the issue of time is so important that people sometimes feel that you don't have a deadline. If you don't have a timeline or a deadline, then it can go forever. But building peace sometimes needs that you don't rush things because it could collapse. And the Syrians will tell you all the time, look, we don't want this example that the UN did or others did, which is of neighboring countries, without naming. Please, look at what is happening there. So don't rush, but also we need a time frame. So a time frame, it's such a delicate thing. You need to make them feel, those who are suffering, that there is, you're not leaving it open. But at the same time, you need to make everybody understand that building peace needs time. I think this is how I'll answer. I don't know if I've answered you. But it's very difficult. The issue of time is very difficult, as you said.
Thank you, Khawla. Simon, would you like
Maybe
to add?
very briefly about the issue of time, which is in fact, as you rightly implied, a key element. It's crucial, and we refer to time very often with the term strategic patience. We have to be strategically patient. And that's us as an outside actor, as a mediator. And sometimes we lack strategic patience because there are other conflicts going on, other conflicts breaking out. Attention is shifting, media attention is shifting. There's also political pressure. There's political pressure to come up with some results. What I mentioned in my presentation, some peace agreements. Politicians want to see peace agreements. And that's really a very difficult point to be in as an outside actor, as an outside player, as a mediator. But it's even more important for the people on the ground. I remember I participated in a conference with the ICRC on missing people in Syria, and I listened to the families who are looking for their loved ones who are gone for 5 years, for 10 years. They have no sign of them. You can talk to them about strategic patience. Yeah. They don't have strategic patience. I understand it. But we understand that peace processes need a lot of time, a lot of investment. And one other issue that is really complicated, this whole time thing, is that in many conflicts you have players who have a lot of time. They have time on their side, and others who don't have time on their side. And this is very often, the time element is very often instrumentalized in such settings. So we as an outside mediator, as someone who tries to balance these interests, have to take the time factor very much into consideration. But it's complex, and it depends a lot on the context. I mean, in some contexts it's maybe a little bit less important, and in other it's really, really crucial, the time factor.
Yeah. Thank you, Simon. And actually, with that, I would like to go over to you, Ester. You know that, of course, witness the humanitarian consequences of the conflict on a daily basis, and from that perspective, of course, you would like this conflict to be resolved immediately. On the other hand, you have the understanding of peace process that usually they need time, and that's of course a struggle. How do you see what comes to your mind when you hear the question of time and the time required for peace processes?
When we talk about time and how to what extent we treat these approaches, if we treat them same, I would say that for timing, I will always say we don't have time. We must act now. And because we must act now, we feel that track 1 and track 2 are much more closer to taking actions, immediate actions, all the time when the need arises. As we have been doing, we've seen we've seen instances where our organizations had to carry out humanitarian response operations. And for us to successfully do that, we needed the grassroots, we needed access, and access is found at the grassroots level. And so we, civil society, had to interact with grassroots. Why? Because these leaders of the non-state armed groups have influence over grassroots. And if we do not carry out timely interventions and know when to do what, it becomes a problem. And going to the upper track 1, I would say it is very difficult. At times, the people there do not have time to listen. They don't have time to pay attention to what is happening. Like we pay attention and as to how grassroots pays attention. There is need for balancing all the time. That's why civil society is called at times to navigate between the grassroots and the political.
Thank you very much, Esther, and all of you for sharing. I have questions incoming here from our virtual audience, and allow myself to combine two questions that have been coming in, and both of them to a certain degree relating to what Esther said about that uphill battle to work towards the political will of those actors holding arms, the main armed conflict parties, to actually come to the table. And one question relates to Afghanistan, of course, and how to build towards a political space for mediation, and the other is a bit more general and say, how can we, with a multi-track approach, with actors working at different levels, how can we work together to work towards that political space, opening, that political will being present? Can I give that question back to you first, Esther, and I will then come back to our panelists here in the room. How do you see different actors, civil society, maybe other international community, other national actors, kind of working together to build that political space?
Yes, there is need for concerted effort and good coordination of actions. This is what we've been lagging in my country, Cameroon. You know, there is need for civil society to connect with grassroots and connect with the political in order to build trust. I want to underline the word trust. This can only happen when we trust each other. We come up with common objectives which are agreed by everyone. This will happen at the level of track 1 easily and track 2, where people will come together, putting aside the differences. We did this in Cameroon. We've been fragmented for so many years, but the Friedrich Ebert Steinfeld Foundation, with the support of the Swiss Embassy and the Canadian High Commissioner, created a platform. They gave us an open space, a platform where we, 38 women organizations, came together and we say, okay, for once, we have been so much fragmented, we've been working in dispersed ranks. For once, let us come together, forget about our differences and negativity. Let us bring in positive energy for the common good of Cameroonians to see how we can contribute in ending this crisis. And of course, we put down, we lay down ground rules which will govern us. And we have finally even come to signing an agreement, a pact agreement between us, the women peace builders, who have subscribed to that initiative of the National Women's Convention. in a nutshell, what do I mean by this? I mean that where there is a will, there is a way. When people see the need to do, they can do, so long as there is trust. I do not want to forget about Toronto. We were invited, we went to Toronto, and this Toronto was another form of coming up with a strong coordination mechanism to see how we can bring our voices together, find common grounds in order to pave the way forward for the conflict rocking this country. So what did we see there? We have leaders of the non-state armed groups which were invited. We also had the religious, we had civil society and other bodies, the media and so on, and the international, of course, though they serve as observers there, which came together for that common good. And we tried to identify, to come up with a consensus, identify those things that will hinder us from working together in order to look at those issues and propose solutions. So again, I come back to the aspect of trust. Trust is very important when we want to carry out coordinated effort or concerted efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Finding that common objective, that probably requires time and dialogue, and also that trust building that you emphasize in terms of then working together. Simon, in your experience, how different actors work together in that way to build towards that political space?
I think, first of all, we should acknowledge that we don't have all these answers, and we should not even try, I think, as a state actor to create political space in Afghanistan or in Cameroon or wherever. It's not something that can be done from the outside. It has to come first and foremost from the inside. We can help, we can give impulses, but it's not something that should be done from a state agency in a third country. I think it's not going to work. And I think we have to focus on our respective strengths. And I said it briefly in my presentation. As a state actor, I think we have to focus first and foremost on the track one, because that's where we have a role to play. But when we talk then about track two or about other tracks, I think we have to work with other actors which are much better than we are as a state actor in creating trust, as Esther rightly said, and to be complementary to what can we do. And that's why, for example, the Cameroon is a good example where we work with you, with others, because you have certain strengths we don't have. And then the key issue is, and Esther also mentioned it, is coordination. That's key. We have to work with the local actors on all the different levels, and we, as an outside source of impulse, of ideas, we have to focus on our respective strengths. But I think it would be completely wrong to believe that we have all the answers and we just bring them and then they're implemented on the ground. It's not going to work.
Mm-hmm. Very important now to understand also the role that one can play and where the value added lies. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. Khawla, challenging question now.
Yeah, no, I focus on, let's focus on trust. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a key word, as Esther said. Trust is important in a political process, mm-hmm. but it's the most difficult to create and to build because of many elements. And I agree with what the ambassador and Esther said. I would like to touch on another issue, and I'm sure that many would not like it. But I think it's important that we be also realistic and frank. And civil society in many of developing countries are actually funded, and the funding sometimes and the donors drive the agendas. And unfortunate as it is, then civil societies become competing on funding and on donors, and this drifts away from their target and their focus. It's something that I've seen, not in Syria, but in the whole, at least, of the region I am familiar with. And this really, really, really needs to be openly discussed and frankly. We cannot fool ourselves by saying civil society are better than the governments. No, they are not. They are not one, so let's not idealize this word of civil society. Let's not idealize the word of common people. People are influenced by those who have power in wherever they are, or those who fund them. So, and they are influenced by a number of elements. Media plays a role in that. And the media, in our region at least, has created a huge division within the Syrian society and community. It's building the society and community is going to be the biggest challenge later on when the Syrians sign a peace treaty and a peace agreement. To rebuild their societies will be the most difficult. And unfortunate as it is, the civil society sometimes worked in a way to divide, not to unite. Let me just say a few words about an experience that is realistic, and that's the Women's Advisory Board that we have. And this this board is composed of women who come from all backgrounds. And so all of a sudden you see women who had a huge experience in promoting women's rights, well, women who come from a local community that is a bit conservative or religious, without making any judgment. I'm not making judgment about who's conservative and who's religious and how you define them. But this is the background. But yet, they managed to sit in a room once after and accept that we are different, but we need to reach a point where we can say, let's go and live together again in Syria. And let's build the Syria that, at least in Syria, but I've seen it also in other countries of the region. I've been in most of these countries during what is called the Arab Spring. So I've been in Egypt, I've been in Tunisia, and Yemen, and in all of them, and in my own country, Bahrain. So it's really difficult because these societies, what happened has divided them. And women see and live the daily impact of conflict on their children and on their lives. And they are the ones who can say, let's swallow our differences, let's sit in a room and work step by step to try and see, okay, you can have this opinion about the role of women, for example, in society, or what constitution should have as element, or what religion is the country, or the name of a state. But let's agree that we need to try and work together to reach something that we all can live under.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for bringing up this issue. I think it's a very important one, and you know, when sometimes we also mistakenly say, well, the voice of civil society, the voices.
Yeah,
which
voices.
every society is diverse and of the different voices. But as you also said, there is competition. We unfortunately lost Ester. Hopefully we can reconnect her.
Yeah.
I'm sure she would like to say something to that as well. And I know you as well. There's also a responsibility, certainly from donors, also in kind of fostering those competitions.
No, thank you so much. Very, very briefly on that point, I found your realistic and frank comment very interesting and important, and I agree with it. However, I would also like to make a realistic and frank and maybe a bit provocative comment. We talk about civil society and the importance of civil society. However, what do you do if no civil society exists?
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And this is a realistic observation of many contexts where you simply don't have a civil society, because having a civil society means that there is a framework in place, let's say a minimal freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, because otherwise you cannot have a civil society. And of course, we know, unfortunately, that around the globe you have countries that work quite or invest considerable resources not to have a civil society. And that complicates then, and I come back to the topic of today, if you work on multi-track peace processes and you don't have a civil society you can really work with, what you do. So you end up with a track one, which might lead to results, but how sustainable are they at the end of the day? So I don't want to enlarge the discussion because it's another discussion, but I think it's also part of a realistic assessment of many of the conflicts we deal with.
That's true. Absolutely. Esther is there.
We got you back, Esther. So we were just talking about, and I'm not sure to what extent you were still able to listen to Khawla when she talked about also diversity of civil society, and that there are also tensions and competition within civil society, and that need to find a level of common ground that allows to work towards a common purpose. Also brought up the question of how donor responsibility also in kind of preventing or not feeding into that competition. Maybe a few thoughts from you, and I would like to open up another opportunity maybe to get a question here from the room before we close. Esther?
Yes, I think, Philip, the issue of the multiplicity of civil society and competition is a major concern here in Cameroon. And the donors intruding, as I would put it, is also another major concern. What we notice is that when civil society sees funding somewhere, especially those who were non-existent or who were the suitcase NGOs, non-governmental NGOs, as we call them, once they hear that there is funding somewhere, they activate or they create, or their relatives who are in positions of power make sure that organizations are created overnight and brought to daylight and showcase as civil society which have been operating. And these are the types that we can to fight those who have had experience, who've been working in the field day and night, simply because they want to be there, as I put it, for a season. And when that season is over, you will no longer see them. These are the ones who fight the genuine civil society, who are out to do the real work. These are the ones who will go and tell partners, carry out smear campaigns to partners about the real civil society. My organization has suffered that. I, as a person, have suffered that a lot. And I can speak authoritatively from experience that, yes, this is what we live every day. Instrumentalization, the divide and rule is so common. And then when you see partners who come, instead of them being, as I'll put it, impartial or neutral in their way of handling, they will take side at times, fueling the crisis or the conflict which exists between civil society, making sure that civil society fight amongst themselves. We say, no, there is no need for that. The space is there. If you know that you can deliver and divide well, stick to your vision, stick to your mission, and communicate that. Let it be seen with the works which you carry out on ground in the field. This is what we always say. And to partners, we always say, please don't instrumentalize us. When you come to us and you see us, take us as we are, and guide us, reinforce our capacity, mentor, coach us, but do not divide us.
Thank you, Esther.
Do not be the agent of disconnect between us, the brothers and sisters. Rather, bring us together, as the example which we saw with the Friedrich Herbert Steinfeld Foundation, and coming with support, external support with partners, as I earlier said. We were so much fragmented. People who never had organizations had to create organizations overnight because of the Anglophone crisis. And because some of them thought that there was a tree of money kept somewhere for them to come and pluck. But when they came, They saw that the reality was different and the infighting was something else. But when we discovered that this is the problem, after analyzing and coming to self-realization that this is the problem, this is where our problem is coming from, we decided to come together to serve as best practice, come up with our ground rules, have a common voice with good coordinated actions, and we successfully held the first ever National Women's Peace Convention, which brought, instead of 1,000 women as was Yemat, 1,500 women. And we saw the diplomatic missions being present. We saw the government being present. We saw in fact, grassroots, everybody, all the walks of life were in a convention in Yaoundé. We had the support of everybody. Why? Because for once, we said, let us not be instrumentalized. Let us keep our differences aside. And let us look at those real civil society who are doing it day and night, who are not politicking civil society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esther, for sharing this experience, which I think is a very powerful one. We're almost finished. I saw there's one more question in the room.
Yes, just briefly, I mean, I like this exchange about civil society very much. But just even though it's towards the end of the panel, I think one should also be careful not to take one version of civil society and the type of interaction which may exist in regard to certain donor agendas and then stigmatize the whole of civil society regarding its role in a given context. I mean, in the end, what does the notion of civil society stand for? I mean, very often these are representatives. I mean, if they are really the same way along Esther described it, I mean, homegrown and with their own power bases and their own traditions. We're not talking about artificially grown NGOs just surviving to implement certain donors' agendas. I'm not at all talking about this type of actors. But there are other actors who are relevant in the religious field, in the business field, in the academic field, and they may or may not be represented in ongoing processes designed to solve, to deal with existing conflicts. And working with them may be a significant contribution to transforming the situation in a positive way, be they fed and supported by external donors, national donors, or private philanthropists, whoever, you know. I mean, governments also get their funding, you know, not only through taxes, but sometimes also through external partners or business actors. So in the end, civil society, in my view, is a concept which is being used to describe a variety of actors not formally included in decision-making processes, but with articulated interests which we, I mean, as a community or as a donor or as whoever, would think are conducive to promoting a peace process. And very often, and I think this is also the way it should be taken into consideration, with the agreement, at least passively, of the government and the powers in place. So this is the way I conceive civil society. And obviously, I mean, Ms. Matar, I fully understand what you said, and this is not the way to handle it, but I think we should be careful to also attribute the diversity to civil society it deserves. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Loro. To close, I would like to give all panelists 20 seconds, maybe to react to that, or just one takeaway you have from this discussion.
No, I don't want to react. I just brought this issue because I felt for a long period of time, not only, and I'm not talking about Syria, but I felt there is an idealization. And so I just wanted to warn or to caution against idealizing any government, civil society, anybody, donors, not to idealize anyone. Religious communities, we've seen all of this in that region where I come from. We've seen all of them. So the only caution I'm saying, and that I would like us to leave with, is that there isn't a situation that is so idealistic for building peace. But we need also to be realistic when we build peace. so that peace can be sustainable. Otherwise, peace will collapse if it's just created by goodwill, many times, very goodwill, people who want to end the conflict and the suffering, but if it's not built on the voices of those concerned, real voices, because there are majority of people whose voices are not listened to, just because they are not in the right side, have the connection. So I think what is important is that what people want, and in my case, I would say, for me, is what Syrians want, is what I would like to help, as small as it is, as an UN and an individual, is to listen to their voices and say what you want in Syria and how you feel the Syria you want. This is what should be. It's not what I feel is good for the Syrians, or how Syria should be. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Be realistic, don't idealize.
Don't
and
idealize
listen.
anyone, including the UN. Including the UN. Just to be very realistic.
Simon.
Thank you so much. I will certainly not try to summarize this very rich and interesting discussion. I learned a lot. I think we agreed here on the panel that the multi-track approach is a kind of an ideal approach. We should strive to work in this direction because it makes a lot of sense theoretically, but also practically. But we also have to be realistic. It's not always easy to do. Sometimes it might not at all be possible to do, but it's an ideal we should, as I said, strive to implement. And it's complicated, and it needs a lot of time.
Thank you. Wow. Good summary. Esther, your sort of final thoughts or one takeaway you have from this discussion?
Thank you very much. One thing I would say is that women are not people's project. Mm-hmm. Women should not be bagged. Women know what is good for them, and they can do it their way. The narrative of women is different from any other person's narrative. They should be allowed to articulate that narrative in order to lead to sustainable peace, navigating in between the various tracks. And I want to end by saying that the communities know those who are for their interests. Mm-hmm. And they accept us. They've seen us. They've been with us. And same do they know those who are against their interest. And so they reject those ones. Civil society is a very big, wide field. But we should be very careful how we use that word and how we use the civil society itself to achieving our desired goals. I will take this away by saying that we are here for you, be there for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esther. On all of you for this rich discussion. I think I will also not try to summarize, but one takeaway I maybe have is, it's also accepting the complexity of the conflict we're dealing with and understanding that multiple efforts are needed and that we have maybe, as different actors from civil society, the national organization, government, have some role to play in a multiplicity of efforts that need to work towards that goal of building sustainable peace. Thank you very much for this rich discussion. Khawla, Matar, Ambassador. Ester, Omam, joining us from Cameroon, and also the audience here in the room, and all of us, those participating from their screens from around the world. Thank you very much. And with that, I close the panel.
Thank you, Philipp. Thank you.